So I wanted to do this video, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to do it in a way that was prepared or if I just wanted to wing it. And obviously, I think I'm just going to wing it because this is something that if I prepare, it's still not going to go the way that I would like it to. And I don't want to risk not doing the video because everything kind of becomes a mess. So what I want to talk about is storytelling. Because it's a shame that it's something that seems to need to be talked about. And sort of something has been bothering me when it comes to storytelling, especially recent storytelling. I get that liberals and progressives and SJWs and the lot, I understand that they got upset. And I'm using that word purposely lightly because they lost their freaking minds with the election of Donald Trump. But it seems that not only have they lost their minds, they've lost, the creative types in particular, have lost the ability to tell a good story. Everything has become this thing about politicking, and it's become about preaching at readers. It's become about shoehorning in, the author's own opinions, and they're forgetting that the purpose of their writing should be to just tell a good story. And key for this is the two recent, fake wedding issues at both Marvel and DC. Yes, I'm talking about comic books, but this is just one thing that has started to bother me. So when they announced that they were going to do these wedding issues for Kitty Pryde and Colossus, I already knew it was going to end with them not getting married. So when that happened, I wasn't surprised. Therefore, I wasn't buying the stories. The same thing with Batman and Catwoman, the whole buildup of they're going to get married, and, I'm sure the majority of readers were like, no, they're not. So because it looks like that's not happened, at least based off of, the New York Times, spoiler-filled article, it wasn't surprising. So here you have two cases where you're telling this story and people are supposed to be excited and there's no payoff. Another example, there is an author that I used to purchase her books all the time, but the past two I've tried, I've had to return them because instead of getting a good story, all I've gotten is politicking and her personal political values, her personal opinions. And it had nothing to do with the story. So it just completely takes you out of the story. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So you have a man and a woman, and this is, I'm just going to say it's a romance because it's sort of become a guilty pleasure for me, mostly because romances are like heavy character driven, and I love a really good character, even though, my heart is like firmly with fantasy novels. But even that I've had a hard time. But anyway, so you have this couple, and you're setting up this story that it's, a guy meets a girl, the girl is in a situation, and, he's going to kind of like swoop in a bit and not necessarily rescue her, but become sort of like a place of stability in her life. But of course, she has to have the sassy Black friends, or I guess the friend wasn't Black, but the sassy gay bestie, and the mother with no filter, because, sassy. And, and of course it's the, this is a strong, independent female and she don't need nobody and she'll beat a man and just a lot of nonsense. But that wasn't even the thing that it did bother me, but it wasn't even the thing that broke me in this case. What broke me in that case was, the guy comes by the house. He and the main female are just trying to have a conversation. And of course, the gay bestie has to interrogate him about his views on LGBT people. But what does that have to do with the story? This is a guy who's not gay. This is a guy who's just trying to date a female. Hasn't said anything to this gay guy to be even treated and interrogated that way. But of course, because we're talking, a progressive author, then the guy has to go into this whole spiel and speech about how he doesn't play that game with sexism and homophobia and whatnot. And it's sort of like, as a woman, because I'm a woman, and I'm also a Black woman, talk like that isn't really attractive to me. Because if I'm trying to have first of all, if I'm trying to have a conversation and then, a supposed best friend is going to jump into it when it's none of their business, I'm really going to have a problem with that. But this liberal attitude that taking you out of the story to preach at you is somehow an okay thing to do. That, and the fact that they're continuing to do this and they're pushing this ideology even more. I look at, I have a hard time with a lot of indie comics, because I have a stack of comics and I kind of want to do a review of them. I'm kind of saving them to do a review. Because I bought these thinking, the overall story sounds interesting, but they all have the same common theme of when you actually sit down and read it, not only does the story not make sense, but it's shoehorned in liberal progressive ideology that completely takes you out of the story because you wonder, well, what does that have to do with anything? Now, to a degree, I'm kind of like, well, why am I even talking about this? And I have to admit, I'm talking about this because I myself write. I have a fantasy trilogy that I've been writing since high school, and I have this fear that I'm going to be like G.R.R. Martin or Tolkien or, the guys who spent like their whole lives working on this, on this one thing. And that would be okay because I want it to be perfect. But because I write, because I have other things that I write, because this is the business I want to get into, not mainstream publishing. Like, I'll admit that, because I'm not a liberal. I'm conservative. I'm open about being conservative. Not only am I conservative, I'm also Christian, and I'm open about being a Christian. And I understand that in the creative world, I'm seeing what happens in comics, and I, am seeing, based on browsing the shelves and whatnot of the fantasy and science fiction, and listening and reading interviews and things like that. So I get where the trend is, and I don't fit that trend because I don't abide by that kind of ideology, for one. And even if I could do an apolitical story, because of my own personal ideology, I just know that they wouldn't fully publish me because of that. But the encouraging thing has been, with the whole, diversity in comics and Uncle Ethan and, the Brett Weisers, and just seeing people begin to crowdfund and work their own projects and things like that, when the internet happened, I saw that as being a beautiful thing, because it gives people like me hope, because it's like you don't need a large publishing house to get your stories out there. You can learn to do it yourself. And of course, with fiction, self-publishing is always a risky thing, because there's a lot of people with no idea what they're doing trying to put out work. But, I also believe in capitalism. So it's sort of like, if people don't enjoy what you do, you don't get paid for it, nor should you get paid for it. Likewise, I just don't believe that, and a reason I have a problem with mainstream publishing is, this idea of what they call diversity. Like, I just find it repulsive. I do believe I wrote once a blog about it. I don't know if I published it, but essentially, I hate that whole idea of what the left considers diversity, because it's diversity only based on skin color, and someone like me wouldn't qualify with diversity simply because I disagree. And so the whole thing would be, either I am to be corrected, or I am to be denied. Seriously, this phone. Or I'm to be denied my quote unquote agency, because how dare I disagree with the trends and the norms. And I know this is kind of like a rambling video. I'm probably going to end up doing a lot of rambling videos, because I love thinking my way through a problem. And why not start a channel where I just ramble my way through problems? It's whatever, right? But there's a book title, and I've not read the book, so I can't even tell you what's inside the book, but I remember the title of the book being very striking to me. And the title of the book was Story Trumps Structure. Now, I didn't buy the book because, let's just be honest, that is something that should just be common sense. The story should always trump the structure, because if you don't have a good story, people are not going to follow you. I've recently decided to essentially nix my current trilogy that I had and do it sort of like I had to pause because I hate summer, because I hate bugs. But But I recently decided to nix the current trilogy that I had, not because the story was bad, but in part because I, as a person, had changed. And so I kept looking back at what I did, and something always seemed not right with the story. And so I wanted to find a way to improve the story and improve the story, because the characters haven't changed and the overall structure of the trilogy hasn't changed. It's just kind of the story. So certain things, that used to fit when I was back in high school, no longer fits today because something got added, and the world that I thought that I knew and had built and developed has suddenly changed. So instead of forcing it to what it had been, I decided to take the story, to its natural conclusion, to see where the story is going to, and to actually do the story in the way that it needed to be told. I understand that that's risky, especially, when you've put so many years, and at this point, decades of work into it. But if it makes the story better, then I say, why not do it? So because I see the things that we read, because readers aren't just readers. They aren't even necessarily fans. Readers are customers. And as someone who is creative, there should be this desire to kind of please your customer to a bit. Now, certainly you don't let the customers run the whole show. But there's become this attitude of creative people saying things like, well, if you don't like my work, don't buy it. And, essentially going out of their way to be offensive so that people not only not buy their work, but never buy their work. And in some cases will leave a whole genre or a whole industry behind. Comics at this point has become so small. And the unfortunate thing is, without a course correction, it's only going to get smaller. And a lot of these SJWs may not mind it, but even they'll be losing out on something critically important. And even though I was going to do this video yesterday, I kind of decided to do it today because I had an additional thought on this idea of storytelling. And this is, the thought came from comics, but it can be applied overall to, creative storytelling. And the thought that I had with the debacle of the 2 special wedding series is that I'm coming to realize that writers in particular seem to be afraid of growth, and they seem to be afraid of change. And they seem to be afraid of their characters changing. So then maybe that's why, I'm doing this whole thing, because here I am as a writer, as a creative person. And when my characters changed and grew, I kind of grew along with it and allowed the characters the space they needed to change. So it becomes grating when you see a possible change and a possible, you know, a possibility of growth in a great character, someone like a Batman. One of the reasons I came back to comics is because I was intrigued by the idea of Superman not just being married to Lois Lane, but Superman now being a dad. And then, you find out that, well, not only is Superman a dad, but, Batman also has a biological kid. And, in the Superman comics, there was this whole dynamic, and it wasn't the main thing, but it was sort of like you see Clark Kent, and Bruce Wayne bonding over not really being sure how to be good dads. And it was character growth. And it was spectacular. It was wonderful because you're seeing these superheroes in a new light, because they're not just two superheroes. They're Batman, they're Superman, and they're always going to be Batman and Superman. But now they're like Batman and Superman who are also dads. So there's that added element of having to grow, because now you have something even more worth protecting. And what is that, for Superman, what does that do? Like the kind of places that it takes you to where you're towing this line, because as a dad, your feelings are different than in just saving someone else, or just saving the world. You're not just saving the world now for everybody. You're saving the world for your kid. There's in one of the, I think it's Superman Volume 2, but Damian Wayne kidnaps Superboy. He kidnaps Jonathan, and my favorite part of that is Batman comes in, sees Jonathan tied up, and is essentially like, let him go right now, because he knows what's going to happen. And then what happens? Superman comes bursting in, give me back my kid, like fire in his eyes. I'm going to tear this whole Batcave apart because you have my kid kind of attitude. They could have done that, something similar, that kind of growth with Batman getting married. Now, I don't like the idea of him marrying Catwoman, so I'm okay with him not marrying Catwoman, because let's be honest, Catwoman is a villain. She's always told the line of being a villain. So there's really no reason why he would have to marry Selina. But if you could make a really dynamic female character, and I know that in the current age of writing, that's really kind of asking a lot, because there is no such thing as dynamic characters in a heavily ideologically driven creative world. But if it were possible to create this really wonderful and really dynamic female character, then it's sort of like, man, imagine what that would be like, where Batman is not just broody McBroodface, that Batman's actually, he's kind of happy. Like, he's in this great relationship. He's still Batman, because Batman's always going to be Batman. And it makes me, I know, and as I talk about this, I think about even like why I don't even engage in a lot of television shows, because it becomes this same thing, this fear that they have that if you put, that if you take the quote unquote relationship drama out of the way, that you have no show. And that's lazy. That's extremely lazy writing. And I hate that kind of writing, because you're asking you're asking people to be, well, I don't even know if they're asking people, but it's sort of like you're expecting us to just sit back and just keep taking this kind of drama and find that kind of drama cute. A show I used to like was Bones, but I got tired of the will they, won't they aspect because I kept saying, we wouldn't lose anything if the main characters just got together. And by the time they did, I didn't actually care about the show because I was so tired of the will they, won't they aspect of it. I was the same thing with, with a lot of those shows. It's the whole will they, won't they thing. I get so tired of the will they, won't they. Because it all goes back to what I said earlier, this fear that writers seem to have of allowing their characters to grow. And the reality is people don't remain the same. Because if they do, then that means that something within them is damaged. Because real people change. When I was in seminary, I had a professor who essentially said, every 5 years, he pretty much went through this transition where the box that he had kind of built to a degree falls apart, and then you're rebuilding it. And I find that in life to kind of be true because we're confronted with new things. We're confronted with new thoughts. We're confronted, or we should be confronted with things that should make us stop and think and should, kind of grow us. And that doesn't mean that who we are at our core is going to be different. That's why I don't think Batman being married, would change who he is at the core. Because at the core, he's still someone who is motivated in saving and protecting his city. So him at the core is a superhero. Him at his core is still a man who works so hard to build his body, to create amazing tech, and be able to compete against his superhero friends who all have powers when he's essentially just a man in a suit who worked hard. That's not going to go away because he's happy. Just like him going from having adopted, all his boys, and, it didn't change the fact that he now had a biological son. Because who he was at his core it still hasn't changed. And so those dynamics just kind of enhanced who he was as both Bruce Wayne and as Batman. And I'm trying to think because it's hard to. Well, you know what? I'm not even gonna do that because the only thing I could suggest to fix it is for other writers and other people who are creative to do, sort of what they're doing, sort of what Diversity in Comics is doing and what, Ethan Van Sciver is doing and what others, are doing in that arena is to create stories ourselves where we concentrate on things like stories, where we, where we sort of make it important for us to say, the story is going to trump the structure. The story is going to trump my politics. It's going to trump my ideology. It's going to do things like that. Now, the only difference would be, is sort of like the Christian fiction genre, because that very much has a purpose, but that's a little bit sort of like a niche market. So you certainly wouldn't, but even there, story would be important. You would just understand that your characters, yeah. So I guess, right, there would be no exceptions in anything creative. It's, the idea of the story that you're telling should be important. And so that would be, I guess, my suggestion of more people concentrating on stories. And maybe, for people who might not want to write or might not want to draw or might not, want to create a product or anything like that, if we as people were more careful with our dollars, if we turned around and we stopped supporting bad storytelling and we stopped applauding authors for bad storytelling and stopped rewarding them for storytelling, because money does talk. When you cannot support yourself, you either changed or you fail. It's the whole sink and swim mentality. It's why I don't mind the idea of a free market, because if nobody reads my stories, then either I'm doing something wrong and I should course correct, or maybe I just have no talent for it and I should go do something else. If we stood firm and just stopped supporting crazies, I think that we could see a real difference. And I think that we could see, the art of storytelling returning, because I think that would be amazing and it would be glorious, and it would help a lot of these businesses that have been going out of business, This video is kind of getting too long for me, but I might do a part 2, and I might be a little bit more prepared, because I might actually want to talk about actual storytelling elements. Like right now, I just kind of wanted to a little bit air my grievances with bad storytelling and just kind of like put it on the table, my own personal commitment to the art of good storytelling, because I'm sounding a little bit like a broken record, but it is incredibly important. It's probably the most important aspect of what a creative person can do in the writing field, is telling a good story, because it's like what sports was supposed to be before, politics got into the NFL. It's escapism. It's what movies were supposed to be. It's escapism. When we're reading stories, we're reading it to relax from the stresses of life. We want to be engaged in something that sort of takes us away from our own personal lives and the own personal things that we do. And we just, for a moment, we just want to take a peek inside of somebody else's life, which is what I find, which is why I find it atrocious that that's kind of like a thing that we're losing. Like, let's just determine to be better storytellers. Yeah, like that's pretty much the thing. Like, let's just determine to be better storytellers. And I don't want to repeat myself too much, so I'm probably going to go at this note. If you made it this far in the video, thank you. I'm going to try to do more content. I'm not quite sure how I want to approach this, but If you're interested, then by all means hit the subscribe button. And also hit that like button if you like this, because it could be interesting. And I'll leave you there. Bye.